This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you're looking at is quieter than that, more dangerous than that. It's a moment when a system stops recognizing itself, when the parts designed to work together quietly step away and something else moves in to fill the space. Nothing collapses on camera. Nothing announces itself, but rules blur, roles shift, and the people inside the system start operating without a shared map. You're told this is about order. You're told this is about safety. But underneath that language is a much older question. What happens when authority keeps moving but legitimacy does not follow? Watch carefully how absence becomes power, how silence becomes permission, how control tightens precisely where trust disappears. If you want to understand what's coming next, you have to see what stopped working first. Stay with me. Because once this process starts, it doesn't reverse quietly. For a long time, we were taught to believe that power lives in people, in offices, in elections, in uniforms. But that's no longer what runs the system. What actually governs now is coordination. Who shows up together, who refuses to, who shares risk, and who quietly opts out. When coordination holds, authority looks invisible. Routine, boring. When it fractures, power doesn't disappear. It concentrates, one layer pulls back, another moves forward, and suddenly enforcement is no longer shared, it's isolated. That isolation matters because isolation changes behavior. It changes decision-making. It changes thresholds. A system built on overlap becomes a system built on replacement. And replacement is always harder, louder, more brittle. This is how control survives without consensus. By narrowing instead of persuading, by acting instead of aligning. Nothing here requires a conspiracy, only disengagement. And once disengagement becomes policy, the system doesn't ask permission before adapting. It just moves. There was a time when the boundaries were clear, not perfect, but understood. Before federal authority moved with local presence, there was a buffer, a handoff, a shared perimeter that absorbed friction before it turned volatile. Now that buffer is gone. What replaced it wasn't announced. It wasn't debated. It just normalized. Federal operations without local anchoring, local institutions redefining their role after the fact, order maintained in fragments, not as a whole. This shift didn't arrive overnight. It arrived quietly through non-decisions, through absences that slowly became standard operating procedure. And slow change is the most dangerous kind because people adapt before they understand what they've adapted to. What once looked like cooperation now looks like parallel systems. What once felt temporary now feels structural. You don't notice the danger when nothing explodes. You notice it when everyone assumes someone else is responsible. And in that gap between expectation and reality, new rules form without consent. That's where the pressure builds. Not at the headline moment, but long before it. And once pressure replaces trust, the next rupture is never accidental. Then the system experiences a shock, not a turning point. I stress test. A federal operation unfolds in public space. Crowds form fast. Tensions rise faster. What's missing matters more than what's present. No familiar perimeter. No layered command. No local authority absorbing impact. Instead, federal agents hold the line alone, doing work they were never designed to do in isolation, managing enforcement and street control at the same time. The confrontation escalates in inches, not leaps. People move closer, voices sharpen, boundaries collapse. In that environment, seconds stretch, judgment narrows. Every approach looks like a threat. A single encounter ends everything for one person. And instantly, the story hardens around the outcome. But that moment is not the story. It's the symptom. Because once a system forces its most rigid tools to operate without its soft buffers, failure becomes statistical, not accidental. If you're being told this was unpredictable, look again. The warning signs were structural. They were visible. They were ignored. And what follows a test like this is never calm. Here's the part most people never see. When coordination collapses, the system doesn't pause. It reroutes. Authority doesn't disappear into chaos. It hardens into procedure. Decision-making narrows upward. Information narrows inward. Oversight narrows until it fits inside a single chain. This is how a fragmented system protects itself. By sealing, by centralizing, by turning transparency into a liability. What looks like control is actually insulation. Evidence becomes internal. Review becomes conditional. Questions become interference, and the damage doesn't land evenly. Risk moves downward. Exposure moves outward. The people closest to the ground absorb the consequences. The structure above them becomes quieter, more opaque. This is not about hiding wrongdoing. It's about limiting variables. When trust is gone, systems don't seek legitimacy. They seek survivability. And survivability favors speed over consent, force over cooperation, silence over explanation. That trade-off works until it doesn't. Because the same mechanisms that protect authority also amplify resistance. And once both sides adapt to each other's hard edges, there is no soft exit left. Now everything accelerates. Not with speeches. With movement, crowds arrive pre-alerted. Positions tighten. Phones come up before voices do. Approach, retreat, circle. Training replaces instinct. Chance replace conversation. Every inch becomes contested. The system responds by compressing time. Commands get shorter. Tolerance gets thinner. Nobody is improvising anymore. Everyone is executing. That's the danger. Because execution removes doubt. And doubt is the last break a system has. Once every actor believes they already know what comes next, every interaction becomes preloaded with threat. Intent stops mattering. Distance stops mattering. History stops mattering. Only trajectory does. And trajectory, once locked, doesn't care about individuals. It only cares about momentum. At this point, escalation doesn't need provocation. It only needs proximity. That's when the system becomes self-driving. And nobody inside it can safely step out. What happens next won't feel sudden. It will feel inevitable. This is where it reaches you. Not as policy, not as ideology, but as environment, because when systems harden, everyday life absorbs the pressure. You start noticing where authority shows up and where it doesn't, which rules are enforced instantly, which ones vanish without explanation. You learn to read uniforms differently, to interpret silence as signal, to understand that protection now depends on alignment, not proximity. And the cost isn't abstract. It shows up in schools, in neighborhoods, in the way parents explain danger without naming it. People are pulled into roles they never volunteered for. Observer, participant, target. Once that happens, neutrality becomes impossible. Even staying home becomes a choice with consequences. This is the human tax of institutional fracture, not chaos, normalization. If this feels familiar, that's not coincidence. It means the system has already moved closer to you than you realized. If you want to understand where this path leads, you can't look away now. Because the pressure doesn't release here. It spreads. This doesn't stay contained. Because systems don't leak outward politely, they ripple. What begins as a local fracture becomes a reference point. Other jurisdictions watch. Other actors learn. They see what happens when coordination breaks and what replaces it. They see which tactics draw response, which ones provoke consolidation, which ones generate attention. and attention is fuel. Across regions, enforcement recalibrates, not toward harmony, but toward resilience, toward operating alone, toward assuming hostility as default. At the same time, resistance networks adapt just as quickly. They share methods, they share language, they share confidence. What was once situational becomes portable. This is how a domestic issue turns systemic, not through a single decision, but through repetition. Each iteration strips away another assumption, another restraint, another shared expectation of how things are supposed to work. And once enough places operate under the same strained logic, it stops being an exception. It becomes the model. The danger isn't that this spreads everywhere at once. It's that it spreads unevenly, creating a country that no longer operates on the same rules everywhere. And systems built like that don't stabilize. They drift. From here, there are only 3 paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system tightens protocols, formalizes isolation, accepts friction as the new baseline. Authority keeps functioning, but colder, narrower, less visible. Order exists, but fewer people recognize themselves in it. The second is erosion. Local withdrawal deepens. Federal presence expands by necessity, not agreement. Every incident feeds distrust. Every response fuels the next confrontation. Nothing breaks all at once, but everything weakens together. The third is rupture, a moment when pressure outruns procedure, when a single encounter cascades faster than institutions can absorb. After that, responses are no longer calibrated. They're reactive, permanent, hard to reverse. None of these paths announce themselves clearly. They overlap, they blur. And the most dangerous thing about this moment is that all 3 can appear rational depending on where you're standing. What decides the direction isn't intent. It isn't ideology. It's whether the system can restore legitimacy before force becomes its only language. That question is still unresolved. But time is no longer neutral. This is not where the story ends. It's where the margin disappears. Because systems don't fail when they collapse. They fail when they stop needing consent, when authority no longer explains itself, when enforcement no longer expects cooperation, when legitimacy becomes optional instead of foundational. At that point, stability looks intact, right up until it doesn't. What replaces trust is procedure. What replaces transparency is control. What replaces coordination is force. And once that trade is made, it's rarely reversed by choice. The question now isn't who was right or who escalated first. The question is whether a system designed to share power can survive learning how to operate without it. If you're watching this, you're already inside the experiment, not as a spectator, as a variable. Because the outcome won't be decided in a courtroom or a press conference. It will be decided by what becomes normal next. What you tolerate, what you expect, what you stop questioning. If you want to understand where this leads, not in theory, but in practice, you need to keep following the system, not the headlines. Because the next phase won't announce itself. And by the time it's obvious, it will already be permanent.